Hello, my name is Sparkle Meadows, and I am so excited to be with you today. And I get a chance to talk to you about building scalable products that drive real impact. Now, before we get started and dive into things, I wanted to give you just a little bit of background on me. My background's pretty diverse. I actually started my career in engineering, and then I worked in healthcare. And then I later transitioned into product. But I've had a lot of experience at a lot of different places. I've actually worked in both the private and the public sector. Early on in my career, I worked both with startups, early stage startups, as well as more established companies like Facebook. So I worked at Facebook before it became Meta. I also have worked in the public sector. In fact, right before my current role, I served as the director of product for the United States Digital Service. And I led the entire product vertical for that organization. And now currently I work at Google and I'm a group product manager working specifically on when inside Chrome, but on the web platform side of the house. So in the work that I've done over the last almost 2 decades, I've had a lot of opportunities to really think about both impact and scaling. Now, two of the defining factors throughout my career have really been around one, doing work that I've considered impactful, and two has been working at scale. Now, you can define impact in a lot of different ways, but for me personally, impact was knowing that the work I put into something had some really concrete outcomes that I could point to. One takeaway that I want to make sure that you kind of get from this is that whenever you think about impact, you should automatically think about outcomes. Now, what exactly those outcomes look like can vary a little bit. But there's two sort of like major things that you want to think about, like as you're thinking about determining impact. The very first one is around measuring outcomes. You cannot determine impact if you are not looking at the outcomes from the work that's been done. So you have to look at, did your solution, did your product, did your feature actually solve the problem it was intended to solve? Now, when you're looking at impact in this way, you're really thinking through metrics, right? We're measuring, did you move the needle? Did you accomplish what you needed to accomplish? So this is very quantitative and it's really easy to sort of determine. The other side of impact is a little bit more qualitative, and it has to do more with like the quality or the value of the impact that you're seeing. So now we're looking at those outcomes. So we have the outcomes because again, impact is always associated with outcomes. But now we're looking at how meaningful those outcomes may be. And this can actually be very individualized and it can be very personal. You may have a different set of a different way to sort of determine impact or a different bar for impact on the quality side earlier in your career versus later in your career. It really just depends. And it can also vary from person to person. Now, early in my career, I was really satisfied with impact that came simply from solving a problem, right? So, maybe we're fixing a bug, we're looking at the progress that happens. On the engineering side of the house, something is not working properly, something is broken. And so you do something in the interim, you fix the problem in some way, hopefully. And at the end of the day, the outcome that you get is that this, whatever it was that you were working on building now functions properly. Really easy to kind of see an outcome there. On the healthcare side of the house, an example would be someone is not well, they're sick, they're having some kind of, something is not going right. And you implement some kind of intervention. Maybe it's a medication of some kind, maybe it's some kind of therapy, and you can see the outcomes from that. You can see how the patient improves. You can see the efficacy. You can actually measure the efficacy of the intervention that you use to really see those outcomes, to see how the patient has improved. So early on in my career, it was really simple. I just wanted to see that there was a problem that my work contributed towards doing something to fix that problem. And now we can see that that problem is solved, or at least that we've made progress on solving that problem. Later in my career, I started thinking a little bit more about the quality of those outcomes. And I really wanted to see that the problem or the product that I was working on was affecting people in a way that I personally found to be meaningful. And that was really what defined impact for me. So one of the examples that I'm going to give a little bit later is an app that I helped build that really saved hours of precious time for medical providers so that they could focus on providing healthcare instead of doing something like filling out an Excel spreadsheet. Now, there is a third way that people think about impact, and that's often thinking about impact in terms of how far the reach is, how many people it touches. But I actually would refer to that as scale. When you're building something new, out of necessity, you have to start small, right? You have a brand new concept, you're building a product for the first time. You start really small. And then as you sort of get that product market fit, as you really sort of determine who your audience is and what they really need, then you can start to grow and you increase. And this can happen very slowly, very gradually, or it can happen really rapidly. And it just sort of depends on a number of different factors. So the takeaway, the big takeaway around scaling that I want you to think about is that when you think about scale, you should really be thinking about growth. Now, over the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some of the different phases you encounter as you're kind of going through this growth process. And as we move between each of those phases, it should really kind of be marked by some very specific scaling goals or milestones that you're going to be keeping top of mind. So the very first thing I want to do is to start by talking about some of the factors that you really should take into consideration when you're setting a scaling goal or a scaling milestone. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, so I'll go ahead and caveat by saying that, but these are three of the ones that are really sort of top of mind for me and that I always like to consider in my own process. The first one is taking metrics-based factors into consideration. You might have a specific set of metrics that you want to keep in mind when you're trying to determine if you're ready to start shifting and setting some new growth goals. This could be maybe a North Star metric that you have. It could be some kind of guardrail metric. I like to think about performance as an example. Maybe you have a website and you know that performance should be at a certain level, but maybe once you have a certain number of folks hitting your website on a daily basis, performance may start to degrade. You may want to be keeping track of that, right? And know that when you hit a certain level, when your metrics hit a certain level, that you really need to start thinking about upgrading your process, looking at your infrastructure so that you can maintain the levels of performance that you want. So it could be like a performance metric. There could be other critical metrics that you want to take into consideration to sort of help you determine if you need to sort of shift into a new phase. Another one that I would call out is around adoption. You should have some pretty specific adoption targets. A lot of times this could be in terms of like the number of partners that you're working with. It could be the number of users that you have using your product, maybe the number of customers that you're working with. It can vary. But typically you may want to keep in mind something around adoption, and that could sort of be what sort of drives you to the next phase. The last one is really around timeline goals, having a specific time horizon. Now, for some products, you might be really considering certain events. You might be very event-based. So as an example, maybe there's a certain event that's going to happen, and that event is going to give your product a lot more visibility. And so you know that you're going to need to be able to support some rapid growth at that particular point in time. So that may be something that you want to factor into your process. So as you're thinking about what you need to have in place in order to grow and scale, you may want to keep that particular date or period of time in mind because you know that you're going to be facing some additional rapid growth around that. You may also be just kind of looking at time in general. Maybe you're a commerce product. And so the time period around the holidays might be one where you expect to be able to take advantage of growth and have the opportunity to scale a little bit more. And so that might be a period in time that you want to keep in mind. So sometimes specific time horizons can also be helpful, a helpful factor to take into consideration as you're looking at setting goals for scaling. Typically, though, it's really going to be a combination of these factors. It won't just be one by itself. It'll be a combination of these factors, and that will really sort of be an indicator to you that it's time for you to either update your goals or to move into the next phase. Now, once you know what factors you're going to be tracking, there are really three key things that you're going to need to do before the end of every phase. And like I said, we'll get into the phases in just a moment. The very first one is to set a goal. So your goal could be really simple. Maybe your goal is going to be, hey, in the next 6 months, we want to be able to support 100 new customers. That could be a goal. Once you set your goal, you want to be able to anticipate the challenges or barriers that you may encounter to meet that goal. So you have to ask yourself the question, what is going to keep me from meeting this goal efficiently and effectively? Can you actually support 100 customers right now? Do you have the infrastructure in place to do that? Do you have the data capacity to store the data for those 100 customers? Do you have the data integrity and security in place to make sure that customer information doesn't get leaked? So you want to think through all of the challenges and the barriers. The third thing is you want to start by addressing the most critical challenges. So you want to address the challenges that are really going to keep you from moving from your current step to your next step. And so you don't need to solve all of the problems. You just need to solve the problems that are going to bring you into the next step. So maybe in your first step, depending on what your product is, maybe capacity isn't an issue. 100, having 100 customers, using your product doesn't affect capacity at all. So that may not be something that you need to think about right now. But you do want to make sure that you're solving the problems for just this step. Now, if we're thinking through this sort of more holistically, your ultimate goal might be to get to 100,000 customers. And if you have one customer right now and your goal eventually is to get 100,000 customers, there are a lot of challenges in there along the way. There are a lot of barriers that you're going to have to overcome. But when you break that down and you start in pieces, so maybe your first goal is to get to 100 customers and you solve the problems to get you to that. And then maybe your next goal that you set after that is maybe to get to 10,000 customers. And then you figure out what you need to put in place to get to 10,000 customers, and so on until you have the capability to support the ultimate goals that you really have. So the goal here is really to sort of break this into stepwise pieces that you're handling one at a time instead of trying to do all of the scaling in one big go, because it's not efficient and it won't really help you in the longer term. So let's talk about how we do these phases and some of the phases that might be as a part of this overall growth cycle. I really think about phase one as being a building phase. This can also be a validation phase. At this point, you're really scrappy. You're building something new. Like I said, you're trying to get some product validation. You're maybe still looking for product market fit. At this juncture, maybe you have a few customers already. Maybe you're trying to onboard some new customers. And essentially, you might really be working to get some feedback on your product. In this phase, everything tends to be very manual, very hands-on. Your product could still be undergoing a lot of changes, especially if you are, starting to get some feedback from those early adopters or early users. One of the nice things about this phase is that a lot of times customers and users will be really forgiving because they know your product is in really early stages. And so ideally, they'll be eager to give you a lot of feedback, both pros and cons, that you can then use to upgrade your product, right? To work on your existing product until it gets into a really great place. And so this is kind of where a little bit of that validation comes in. But once your product stabilizes and you've really figured out enough product market fit that you're really confident in the direction that you're headed, you can start thinking about scaling. Now, this is an inflection point between phase one and phase two where the work really starts. And so this is where you want to sort of set that first goal. Now, as we move into phase two is really characterized by interim solutions. We're looking to start optimizing our internal solutions and figure out how we can streamline things a little bit more. At this point, you have product market fit already. That is set, that is done. You might have people who are still very hands-on, but really in this phase, it's characterized by adding in additional resources. Sometimes this can be in terms of team support. So this might be the place where you start to grow your team a little bit more. Maybe your teams start to get a little bit more specialized. A lot of times in startups, one of the things that I always think is kind of fun is, it's all hands on deck, right? Like your job description doesn't always matter because you may have to put on a lot of different hats when a product is in its very early stages in order for it to be a success. By the time you get to the optimization phase, you should be in a position where folks can start to specialize a little bit more and really kind of focus on building out their particular areas of the product that they support. This is also the time where you can get some more specialized technology. Maybe you've settled on using like a very specific engineering framework. And now we're committed to it. This is definitely what we're going to be using. But this, again, we're really working on putting things in place internally to support the work that's being done. Now, after you move from this optimization phase, which again is streamlining your internal processes, we really want to move into a third phase. This third phase, the automation phase, it's really characterized by investing in more automated or enterprise level solutions. So in phase one and phase two, there's a lot of hands-on activity, there's a lot of manual activity, and a lot of back and forth. Once you get to phase three, you're really replacing those critical manual tasks with that automation. And so in this case, again, it may involve a larger team, and typically you'll have more significant infrastructure support. You will have the data capabilities that you need. Maybe that security infrastructure that you really didn't care a ton about in phase one or phase two, this is really going to be the time to put those pieces into place. So phase three is really where you start to think about pulling the pieces together so you can work efficiently at scale. even though you may not be quite there yet. So this is really where you're ensuring that your internal solutions are going to be sustainable for your product, for your customer base, and for your business. Now, the final phase, I call it scaling, but it's a little bit of a misnomer because the work that we've been doing throughout the process is really building up to scaling. These are all key pieces of the growth and scaling process. But now, as we head into this final phase, this is where we really can start to focus on go to market activities a little bit more. We already have all of the infrastructure in place to support growth. And so now we can kind of shift and think about how do we now increase that volume, right? And so you can also, during this phase, you have the ability to start thinking about one, not only how do you bring growth into your existing workflows efficiently, but two, maybe how do we expand into new markets? A lot of times, as you expand into a market or into a new area, there may be some additional requirements that your product has to start considering that up until this point, it wasn't really necessary. So as an example, if you have a product that you want to bring into the US federal government, they have a lot of very stringent requirements around what they want to see from a security perspective and a number of other things in order to support that product internally. So this could be a chance where you start to think through, okay, what would I need to add, or how do I need to modify my product or my infrastructure, or whether or not you're using cloud for data storage. Those might be things that you start to think about in this phase. The same thing is true if you're thinking about expanding into a market like the European Union. They have a lot of very specific requirements. For example, there are a lot of legal requirements that come into play. And so during this phase, if that's a market that you were interested in exploring, you know that you have the infrastructure in place to support the growth in general, but now you may need to sort of change a few things or implement some additional things that are really specific to that market. So that's one of the things that you can do in this phase 4. So not only can you invest a little bit more in just general go-to-market activities, but you can also think about how you can incorporate some, what may be some specific requirements so that your product can continue to grow into more specific markets. So I want to take a second and give you a really practical example so you can kind of see how the phases work with the scaling goals. So the example here is going to be around scaling a brand new app. This is actually an app that I worked on back during COVID times. This was an app that we built that was intended to help with the reporting of patient data during COVID. So if you recall, COVID was a very unfortunate time. A lot of times you have to get COVID tests done, and those results would get sent to either the local health department and or your federal health department. So local, state, federal, depending on where you lived, there were some different rules around that. And it was used by, this particular app was used by urgent care, school systems, elder care facilities, and a lot of other types of facilities to collect that information and then distribute that information to the places that it needed to go. Now, the overall goal for this application was to reduce the reporting burden on the individuals who are required to sort of collect this information and then report to their health departments. Now, one thing I do want to make really clear is that this was a really complex project. It had a number of considerations, both on the front end and the back end. As we were scaling, we were thinking through things like data transmission type. Are we using FHIR? Are we thinking HL7? We had to think through data storage and data security and privacy requirements and how things were different at a local level versus a state level versus a federal level, and even more things than that. So there were a lot of considerations that we had. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to just talk about one very specific aspect just to give you an example so you can kind of get a sense of what I mean. So the example that I'm going to give is going to be around login and identity verification. So we're going to start in the building phase. We had a very, very small team. It traveled all over the country during COVID. And the goal was really to meet with healthcare providers and hear from them directly to figure out what they would need from an application during this time. Now, by and large, the feedback that we got was that they really needed a simpler and faster way to report their COVID-19 results. I remember I spoke with one woman. She was a nurse, and she was telling me how, over the course of the day, they would do different COVID tests of different patients. You'll remember they even had you could have drive-up sites where you could go and get a COVID test. But she would be collecting data from all of these patients, right, over the course of the day. So it's not only the COVID results, it's all of their basic patient information, their demographics, all of that information. And she would have to submit all of that to her health department. And the way that she was submitting it was through an Excel spreadsheet. But that wasn't how she was collecting the data. She was collecting the data, they had pieces of paper on hand. And so she was then having to transcribe all of that information, put it into an Excel spreadsheet. Unfortunately, she was not really familiar with Excel. She was not comfortable using Excel. And so it took her hours and hours to take all of that data that she was collecting on a daily basis, put it into this Excel spreadsheet and send it off. And those were hours that really she could have been spending treating patients and caring for patients. So we really were able to sort of identify, hey, you know what? We've identified a problem. We've identified a way that we can solve it. We feel like we have some really strong product market fit here. And so we came up with that core app functionality and we launched this app with one customer in one state. The customer that we were working with, it was like an elder care facility. They actually had 3 different sites that they operated. And we started the process again in that phase 1 building phase in a very manual way. We manually generated their login information. I remember myself and one of the other PMs, we actually like had a call with them the day that we launched and walked them through the app, how you log in. We made sure that everyone could log in properly. And if someone needed to reset the password, that was something that we could handle, live, and we would just sort of take care of those things. We also knew who we were dealing with, right? Because either we were having a conversation via video conference, or members of the team had actually, physically encountered these people, earlier in our process. So that was sort of how we did the login and the identity verification in that very first phase. Now, after we got that first site set up, we set a goal. And the goal was that we wanted to have 100 new sites come on board over the course of the next 3 months. Now, this was a very aggressive goal at that time, and we recognized that it was an aggressive goal, but that's what we wanted. That's what we were building towards. And because we knew that was the goal, we actually needed to think through what kind of infrastructure we needed to put in place so that we could actually support that many people. And so we worked on putting those things together, and that was really what kind of was bringing us into that phase 2 where we hit optimization. Now, in phase 2, we were like, in order to optimize our internal process, we can't continue doing these things manually. So by the time we got to phase 2, we actually had a team of customer service folks in place who were manually generating and resetting the password. So we talked a little bit about how there could be some specialization. That wasn't really the best use of my time or the other PM's time who was working on the application. And so we actually brought in a team of support that they could do the manual resetting and generating of passwords and login information. The identity verification actually became even more important because as we were supporting more sites, we're dealing with private patient data. It was really, really important to be able to confirm that the right people had access to that information. And so the team that we had in place was able to do that. They actually set up a video conferencing. We had a video conference where you could set up some time to verify your ID and your birth certificate or your passport or whatever it happened to be. And even in this phase, this optimization phase, we even morphed that process a little bit. So it started off super manual. Someone would say, we would have a site that would reach out and say, oh, hey, we've hired 2 more people. They need to have access to the system. In the olden days, I say the olden days, early on in our process, they would have to email, they might email me and, I would get them set up and I would be coordinating with this team so we could figure out the time so that they could actually, do their verification. That it was, again, still very manual early on, but by the end of that sort of like optimization phase, we actually had it way more streamlined where they just had calendar links set up and there was no middleman. It was just directly between the person who needed to set up the appointment and then the customer service team was able to sort of schedule those things directly. So even within a phase, you can improve optimization as you go. So even as we move through this optimization phase and we realize, okay, we're putting these new things in place, this is going to allow us to continue to grow and scale. Where do we want to grow next? And so our next scaling goal was really to support 500 customers across 3 states. So we really wanted to expand in some additional states. Obviously, we wanted to continue to get people on the platform and using it. And in order to support that goal, we knew that the next thing that we really needed to move towards was a more automated system. We needed something that was more sustainable than what we currently had. And that's really what brought us into that phase 3. Now in phase 3, we ended up being able to get login actually managed by an enterprise solution. So you can think about Okta. We also were able to add in, initially we had we still had the live ID verification with that team that I mentioned earlier, but we were really able to shift away from that and move into a third-party automated ID verification system. And so by the time we got to the end of phase 3, we were able to shift and have everything automated. And that really is what set us up for that phase 4 scaling. So as we were looking at setting a new goal between phase 3 and phase 4, we really were kind of shifting away from how many customers can we support and what are the timelines that we're looking at. And it was more so about, now we just wanted everything. Now we're just ready to grow, right? We want to be in all 50 states. We want to be in all the US territories. We have the infrastructure in place to do that. And that was just really where we wanted to be. But as we were in that phase 4 scaling, not only did we want to grow with our existing product line, but we realized that because of that infrastructure that we put in place, we actually had an opportunity to grow even further. There are a number of other diseases that people are having to report in very similar ways. They're facing the same struggles, the same burden. They're spending a lot of time filling out, documentation or Excel spreadsheets. And instead of doing that, they actually could use our platform to do that instead. And so in that phase 4, as we continue to think about growth, we not only thought about scaling, throughout the United States and the territories, but we also started to think about, okay, how can we actually start scaling to additional diseases? And the flu is a great example of that. And so that's really where we kind of went back into a phase 1, right? We still have the infrastructure in place to support, managing the data, managing like the login, the identity verification, and all of that. But now we're back in a building phase because now we're thinking through, okay, we have a new disease that we want to cover. What does that look like? How do we need to change our application to support that so that it's appropriate for that particular use case? So as I mentioned, login and identity verification was really just one of the considerations that we had in our scaling process. But this was just to sort of help give you a practical example of how you can kind of move through the phases and start thinking about the goals that you're setting along the way. So I don't want you to walk away and without a couple of key insights. The very first one, as I said earlier, impact is always outcome focused. If you don't remember anything else, please remember that. Whenever you want to think about impact, you want to think about the outcomes. The second insight that I have is that impact can be both value and metrics based, right? So there's those two components to it. You have the measurement side, but there can also be a value consideration to it as well, and that can be very personal. The third insight that I have for you is really around scale. And this is that scale is about efficiently growing your impact and reach. Growth is awesome, but if you're not growing efficiently and if you're not sort of combining that with the impact, you're not necessarily doing it right. So we really want to make sure that we keep in mind scale is tied to that efficient growth. And then finally, just remember that successful scaling, it's that iterative and self-sustaining growth. So that's when we're really moving into those automated phases and everything is optimal. So successful scaling is a result of iterative and self-sustaining growth. So you may be asking yourself, what can I do? What are some of the next steps that I can take? And so I have a few things, both for folks who are interested in looking at impact, as well as a couple of things for folks who are interested in thinking through scaling. On the impact side, you really need to decide what impact means to you. Ask yourself the question, what's important to me and what outcomes am I expecting to see from my work? And again, remember, to really get at the impact, you've got to think about the outcomes. On the scaling side of the house, I would love for you to take a moment to think through some of those key characteristics that we discussed of those different phases to try and figure out which phase you might be in right now. Are you in a building phase? Are you still looking for product market fit? Do you have product market fit? Do you have the teams in place? Are you already on the automation side? So you want to take a moment and sort of figure out which phase you're in and just recognize that your steps are going to look very different if you're still in a building phase versus if you're in one of the later phases. But regardless of which phase you're in, I would really encourage you to set your next scaling goal and really understand what challenges you need to overcome so that you can get where you want to go. And with that, thank you so much. I hope that this has been helpful. Thank you for taking time out of your day to chat with me. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.